August 8, 1944, south of Caen, Normandy. The fog hung thick over the narrow dirt road, turning the hedgerows into walls of shadow. Inside the lead Tiger tank, the commander wiped condensation from his periscope and squinted into the gray dawn. Behind him, 3 Panzer IVs followed in column, their crews confident, almost bored. They had crushed Polish cavalry, swept through France in weeks, and survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. Tonight's patrol was routine. The enemy ahead would be the usual fair, thin-skinned Shermans, perhaps a few outdated British Cromwells. Nothing that could threaten a Tiger from the front at any reasonable distance. The math was simple, comfortable, reassuring. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this deep dive into one of World War II's most overlooked stories, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Whether you're in Toronto, Berlin, or halfway around the world, we love hearing from you. Share this with anyone who appreciates real history told the way it deserves to be told. Now, let's get back to that foggy road in Normandy. The flash came first, a searing green-white flare from the hedgerow to the left. Then the sound, a sharp crack like a giant whip snapping across steel. The Tiger shuddered violently. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the interior erupted. Ammunition detonated in a cascading roar. Flames shot from every hatch. The 57-ton monster, Germany's pride, its frontal armor supposedly impenetrable, was dead before the commander could even scream a warning. The Panzer IVs behind it spun their turrets wildly, searching for the threat. Another flash, another crack. A turret sailed through the air, separated from its hull as cleanly as a surgeon's cut. In the chaos, over the radio, someone shouted a single word that sent ice through every surviving German crewman's veins. Canadians. In that moment, peering through smoke and flame at shadows that refused to reveal themselves, the German tankers understood a terrible truth. The rules had changed. The equation that had kept them alive, superior armor, superior optics, superior range, no longer applied. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were the prey, and the predators wore the red maple leaf. The transformation hadn't been sudden. In September 1939, when Hitler's panzers rolled into Poland, Canada's armored force barely existed. The entire nation could field perhaps 24 obsolete tanks left over from the First World War. Canada was a country of 3.7 million people, a dominion still finding its identity, standing in the long shadow of the British Empire. Yet within 5 years, Canadian tank crews would earn a reputation that made even the most hardened Waffen-SS veterans hesitate. The question wasn't whether Canada had better tanks, they didn't. It wasn't whether they had more tanks, they didn't. The question was how they turned borrowed equipment and sheer tactical aggression into a weapon that terrified the most experienced armored force in the world. The first lesson came written in blood on the stones of Dieppe, August 19, 1942. The raid was supposed to test Allied capabilities for the eventual invasion of France. Instead, it became a slaughter. The Calgary Regiment's Churchill tanks, heavy and slow, struggled on the pebble beach. German coastal guns, pre-sighted and dug in, picked them off methodically. Of the 29 tanks that made it ashore, not one made it back. The crews that survived the burning steel were captured or killed. It was a disaster of the first order. But in the smoking wreckage of that failed assault, Canadian military planners learned something invaluable. You cannot charge a prepared German position and expect to win. Armor alone meant nothing without terrain, surprise, and ruthless exploitation of enemy weakness. That lesson was reinforced in the mountains of Italy. Canadian units that landed there in 1943 found themselves fighting in terrain that no tank manual had ever contemplated. Narrow mountain passes, ancient stone villages turned into fortresses, valleys that became shooting galleries. The Germans, masters of defense, buried Panther turrets in concrete bunkers along the Gothic line. They positioned Tigers at the ends of long, straight roads, daring the Allies to come forward. But the Canadians didn't come forward, not the way the Germans expected. They went around. They went over. At the Liri Valley and the Hitler Line, Canadian M10 tank destroyers crawled up slopes that German commanders had marked as impassable for armor. Imagine the shock. A panzer crew positioned to cover the main road, comfortable in their concrete bunker, suddenly taking fire from a ridge to their flank. The Canadians learned to turn terrain into a weapon. They learned patience. They learned that killing a tank wasn't about being stronger, it was about being smarter, quieter, and more willing to take the shot that mattered. By the time they landed on Juno Beach in June 1944, the Canadian tank crews were no longer the volunteers of 1939. They were veterans. They understood the brutal mathematics of armored warfare. A standard Sherman with a 75mm gun couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any reasonable range. A Tiger could kill a Sherman from 2 kilometers away, long before the Sherman could even fire back. This was the equation that gave German crews their confidence, their swagger. But the Canadians brought a new variable to the battlefield. They brought the 17-pounder. The Ordnance QF 17-pounder was a beast of a weapon. It fired a solid shot at nearly 3,000 feet per second. When British engineers developed a specialized round the armor-piercing discarding sabot, or a PDC, the gun became something else entirely. A tungsten dart encased in a light sleeve fired at hypersonic velocity. When it struck armor, it didn't just penetrate. It shattered. From 1,000 meters, a 17-pounder could punch through the frontal plate of a Tiger. The German margin of safety vanished. The distance that had once protected them meant nothing. The most infamous carrier of this weapon was the Sherman Firefly. Fitting the massive 17-pounder into a Sherman turret was an engineering nightmare. The recoil was violent. The breach was so large they had to cut a hole in the back of the turret to fit the radio. The crew worked in a space so cramped they could barely move, but it worked. And more importantly, it looked almost identical to a standard Sherman from a distance. The Canadians exploited this ruthlessly. They used counter-shading, painting the barrel in patterns that disguised its length. They added false muzzle brakes. From 800 meters through the scratched optics of a Panzer periscope, a Firefly looked like just another harmless 75mm Sherman. A German tank commander would scan a field, see 5 Shermans, and prioritize other targets. By the time he realized one of those Shermans had a gun that could kill him, it was too late. German tankers learned to fear the Firefly more than any other weapon. Orders went out across the Wehrmacht: identify and destroy long-barreled Shermans immediately. But the Canadians were always one step ahead. They used their standard Shermans as bait, drawing German fire, while the Fireflies sat hidden, waiting for the muzzle flash that would reveal the enemy's position. It was psychological warfare fused with tactical brilliance. Every Sherman became a potential threat. Every hedgerow became a possible ambush. The paranoia was paralyzing. The Canadians didn't stop with the Firefly. They fielded the M10 Wolverine and its British cousin, the Achilles and M10, rearmed with the 17-pounder. These tank destroyers had thin armor and open-topped turrets. A direct hit from almost any German gun would kill the crew instantly. This vulnerability forced a different kind of aggression. Canadian M10 crews couldn't afford to be seen. They perfected the hull-down position, creeping up to ridge lines until only the gun barrel and turret were visible. They would fire, then immediately reverse back down the slope, before the enemy could return fire. Shoot and scoot. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, except the mouse had a gun that could kill the cat from a kilometer away. In the dense bocage country of Normandy, the Canadians also mastered the art of the hidden gun. Towed 6-pounders and 17-pounders, dragged by hand into the thickest hedgerows, covered with foliage until they were invisible from 5 meters away. The crews would wait in silence, watching 57-ton tigers rumble toward them, the ground shaking, the noise deafening. Firing too early meant the shell might bounce, and the tiger would turn its machine guns on you. Firing too late meant being crushed under the tracks. Canadian doctrine emphasized holding fire until the last possible moment, often less than 200 meters. At that range, the 17-pounder didn't just penetrate, it obliterated. From the German perspective, this turned every bush, every shadow, every corner into a potential death sentence. The psychological shift was profound. In 1940, panzer crews were the hunters. By late 1944, in Canadian sectors, they were the prey. And they knew it. Operation Neutralize began on the night of August 7, 1944. The objective was to break through German lines south of Caen and close the Falaise Gap, trapping the retreating Wehrmacht. The Canadians did something almost unthinkable. Hay launched a massive armored assault at night. Tanks are nearly blind in darkness. But the Canadians used artificial moonlight giant searchlights, bounced off low clouds, to create an eerie, diffuse glow over the battlefield. Columns of Shermans and N-10s advanced in tight formation, bypassing German strong points, driving deep into enemy territory before the sun even rose. When dawn broke, German panzer crews woke to find Canadian armor already behind their lines. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, fanatical and experienced, launched immediate counterattacks. These were not ordinary Germans. These were the same troops who had executed Canadian prisoners in the early days of the invasion. There was no quarter asked or given. The fighting near Cento and the Verrières Ridge was brutal, close range, and personal. And it was here, in this cauldron of hate and fire, that the legend of the Canadian tank hunter reached its apex. Michael Wittmann, the Black Baron, was the most famous tank ace in the German army. He had destroyed over 130 Allied tanks. His Tiger was a symbol of German invincibility. On August 8th, he led a counterattack into the Canadian advance. Historians still debate exactly who fired the fatal shot, whether it was British yeomanry, the Canadian Sherbrooke Fusiliers, or Polish armor. But the context is what matters. Wittmann drove into a trap. Hidden 17-pounder guns, positioned in the hedgerows, engaged from the flank. The great ace, the man who had terrorized Allied tankers for years, was killed in an ambush. Not in a glorious duel, not in a fair fight. He was shot from hiding by a gunner he never saw. That moment symbolized the entire Canadian approach. They didn't care about honor in the knightly sense. They cared about winning. They cared about going home alive. And they understood that the best way to kill a tiger was to shoot it before it even knew you were there. The Falaise pocket became a killing field. As the German army tried to escape through a narrow corridor near the town of Falaise, Canadian Armoured Divisions positioned themselves on the high ground. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. Canadian tankers described firing their machine guns until the barrels glowed red. Fireflies sat hull down on the ridges, systematically destroying every German tank that tried to break through. A German survivor wrote in his diary, "It was a corridor of death. Burning steel everywhere. If you moved, you died." The Canadians did not stop. They did not rest. They just kept firing. By the time the gap closed, the fields were littered with the carcasses of panzers, half-tracks, and horses. The once mighty divisions that had terrorized Europe were reduced to smoking wreckage. Later that autumn, the Canadians fought in the Scheldt estuary, a landscape of flooded polders, dikes, and canals. It was terrain universally considered impossible for tank warfare. The Germans believed they were safe. The Canadians proved them wrong again. They became water rats, using amphibious vehicles and sheer determination to drag their armor through waist-deep mud. In these conditions, a heavy Tiger was a liability. It sank. It bogged down. The lighter Sherman, with duckbill track extenders, could keep moving. Canadian tank destroyers used the dikes as cover, creeping to the crest, firing a shot across the flooded plain, then vanishing back down the reverse slope. The Germans were forced onto predictable roads where pre-sighted guns were waiting. It was asymmetric warfare at its most brutal. Inside the steel coffin of a Panzer IV, the world had become a nightmare. The math that once protected German crews, the equation of armor thickness versus penetration, had collapsed. The safe zone no longer existed. A 17-pounder APDS round traveled so fast that it hit the tank before the sound of the gunshot reached the crew. There was no whistle, no warning, just a sudden violent crack like a whip snapping against steel. One moment you were scanning a tree line. The next, your driver was dead, and the ammunition was cooking off. The randomness of it shattered nerves. Even the most experienced SS veterans began to hesitate. Word spread through the Wehrmacht. Soldiers talked in field hospitals and mess tents. The British were methodical. The Americans were overwhelming. But the Canadians fought with a cold, calculated fury. After the atrocities at Arden Abbey, where the 12th SS executed Canadian prisoners, there was a personal edge to every engagement. A captured German officer reportedly said, "The Americans fight to go home. The British fight for duty. The Canadians fight like they are angry." For a panzer crew, this meant that retreat wasn't always an option. When you saw the maple leaf, you knew the enemy was going to close the distance, use the terrain, and fight through the night. The fear manifested in a specific behavior: target fixation. German gunners were trained to identify and prioritize fireflies, but the Canadians weaponized this paranoia. They knew the Germans were looking for the long barrel, so they used camouflage, deception, and bait. A German gunner would see 3 Shermans crossing a field. He would pause, squinting through his optics. Is that second one a firefly? Is the barrel painted? Is there an Achilles hiding in the hedge? That split second of hesitation was often fatal. The firefly, sitting still and camouflaged, would already have its crosshairs on the Panzer's ammunition rack. In the dense hedgerows and forests, visibility was terrible. German optics, superior in the open steppes of Russia, were useless when you could only see 50 meters. A captured diary from the Scheldt campaign described the feeling. The mud is everywhere. We cannot see. Every shadow could be a tank destroyer. We are blind giants, stumbling in the dark, waiting for the hammer to fall. The silence of the Canadian lines was more terrifying than the noise of the American ones. Silence meant the hunters were waiting. By the spring of 1945, the psychological victory was complete. German prisoners captured by Canadians often asked to see the automatic anti-tank guns. They couldn't believe human crews could reload and fire with such speed and accuracy. They weren't automatic. They were just Canadian crews, drilled to perfection, fueled by adrenaline and the knowledge that hesitation meant death. The myth of the Bermensch, the superior soldier and the superior machine, had been shattered by farm boys from the prairies and fishermen from the Maritimes. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the landscape of Europe was littered with the rusting hulks of German armor. The Tigers and Panthers, built to last 1,000 years, were reduced to scrap metal. Historians and strategists began to analyze what had happened. The narrative that German technology was superior had been proven incomplete. Yes, the Germans built better tanks, but the Canadians proved that doctrine, aggression, and tactical brilliance could overcome raw engineering. They combined American logistics, British weaponry, and a uniquely Canadian philosophy of war. They were the only Allied army to fully embrace the hunter-killer mindset at every level, from the individual tank commander hiding his Firefly in a barn to the Corps commanders planning massive night assaults. The men who fought in those Shermans and M10s were not born warriors. They were volunteers. They were young, most in their early 20s. They knew the odds. Every time they climbed into a Firefly, they knew they were sitting on a priority target. Yet, day after day, from Juno Beach to the Rhine, they started their engines. They lived in a world of high-stakes hide-and-seek, where a single mistake meant incineration. The courage required to hold fire until a tiger was 200 meters away, watching a monster grow larger in your sights, knowing that if you missed you wouldn't get a second chance, it defies comprehension. The tactics they pioneered are still studied today. The concept of using light, mobile assets to ambush heavier forces is a cornerstone of modern asymmetric warfare. They proved that heavy armor, no matter how thick, is vulnerable to an enemy who understands terrain and timing. But perhaps their greatest legacy is the respect they earned from the enemy. German panzer crews, proud and skilled, were forced to admit they had met their match. They were not beaten by waves of steel or sheer numbers alone. In the Canadian sectors they were outfought. They were outsmarted. They were hunted. Today, you can walk through quiet fields in Normandy. The hedgerows are still there, thick and green. Cattle graze where tank battles once raged. If you look closely, you might find a rusted track link or a scarred stone wall. But the true monument isn't in the metal. It's in the silence that reigns where monsters once roared. The Canadian tank hunter was an anomaly in military history, an underdog who refused to accept his role. He took a borrowed tank, a massive gun, and a cold determination, and he went out to hunt the most dangerous game on earth. And he won. In the annals of war, the tiger will always be remembered as a symbol of terrifying power. But let history also remember the answer to that power, the flash from the hedgerow, the crack of the 17-pounder, and the maple leaf painted on the side of the hull. For the panzer crews who lived through the summer of 1944, the war didn't look like propaganda reels. It looked like a shadow waiting in the dark. And that shadow was Canadian.